My name is Lívia Barbosa, and I am a master's student at UFMG in Brazil. And I'm here to present this work that was a collaboration with my advisor, Andrea Ora, where we investigated how and why developers migrate Python tests. Python is one of the most popular programming languages nowadays, and the testing landscape of Python systems is basically dominated by two testing frameworks. The first is unit test, that was inspired by JUnit and is part of the Python standard library. It has been around for some time, while PyTest is a third-party testing framework that makes it easy to write small tests and scales to support complex functional testing. Basically, we only need a function with the prefix test inside a test file, and that will be considered a test case. Unit test relies on inheritance to create test cases, and it has a long list of assertion methods, while PyTest leverages the native assert API for verifying expectations and values and relies on functions to create tests. There are a lot of other differences, which includes to create, test setup, and parameterize tests. And the great advantage for PyTest is that it runs unit test tests, while unit test doesn't offer support to PyTest tests. So by just looking at these basic examples of how we can write tests with each framework, we can see why developers can be motivated to write smaller and cleaner test cases. Here is a real example of a file that performs this migration. If one wants to migrate, it will follow some basic steps. For example, removing the line that imports the unit test library, then removing the class to stop using the subclass technique required for unit tests, and only use functions. And lastly, replace assert methods by the built-in assert statement. It is also possible to migrate test setups. In this case, it was also needed to move the setup operation and transform it in a fixture. In this case, multiple fixtures, what can increase reusability. We notice that migration is happening, it is being discussed, but we are not yet aware of how it is done nor why developers perform the migration. This knowledge can be used to understand migration practices, supporting the production of a more efficient migration process. To understand the problem, we propose 5 research questions. The first is a motivational one to understand to which extent unit test and PyTest are adopted. Then we assess the frequency, duration, and code transformation in systems that migrated or are migrating. Lastly, we investigate why developers start this process. To investigate each of these questions, we propose a 4-step study design. The first 3 steps are related to the first 4 research questions, and the last step was designed for the last research question. So what kind of systems we considered? We defined some questions to assess the current state of the migration, and we wanted to study real-world and relevant systems. So we analyzed the top 100 most popular open source repositories on GitHub. We used the number of stars as a proxy to popularity, and we excluded the ones that were not a system, for instance, repositories with algorithms for learning purposes, and the ones which the description was not written in English. The dataset, which is public, includes well-known systems such as Django, Pandas, and scikit-learn. To detect which framework was used in each version of the system, we inspect every commit and search for the occurrences of the terms unit test and PyTest, which may happen in imports and decorators. We considered the Python source code, configuration files that can be used by CI/CD tools, and also script files. but just knowing which framework is used in each version of the system is not enough to infer that the migration is happening. For example, the system might be relying on both test frameworks and not necessarily migrating. So we propose a concept of migration commits, which is a commit that explicitly migrates code from unit test to PyTest, as in the examples we saw before. To identify migration commits in the multiple versions of the system, we utilize PyDriller, which is a tool and a framework to mine Git repositories. For each system, we iterate on its commits, analyzing the removed and added lines, looking for code transformations. In this table, we have a summary of code transformations that characterize each type of migration. Both the unit test removal and the PyTest addition must happen. Each migration commit needs to have at least one of these migrations, but more than one can occur. Migration commits allow us to discover the migration stage. This figure illustrates the relation between migration commits and migration stages. Black dots represent normal commits and orange dot migration commits. If the system does not have migration commits, let's say for example it only relies on unit test, it is considered not migrated. As soon as the first migration commit is identified, we consider the system as ongoing. In this phase, we know the system relies on both test frameworks and is performing a migration. Notice that we can have normal commits along with migration commits. Lastly, if we identified migration commits in the system and today it only relies on PyTest, it is considered migrated. Lastly, to address the last research question, we first queried the GitHub search API for the term unit test to PyTest. Then we selected the first 100 results that included pull requests and issues. To filter out false positives, we only selected the issues and pull requests whose titles had some indication of migration and whose descriptions had some advantage or disadvantages listed. We got 61 results after this filter. We also did a thematic analysis to classify them. Now we'll see the results for each research question. The result for the first research question is presented in this table that summarizes testing framework usage over time. We can see that 31 did not change the testing framework, and 39 started with unit test and now relies only on PyTest or on both testing frameworks. We will inspect a subset of these in the next research questions. We see that the total does not sum to 100, and that's because 23 systems do not fall in any category because they do not rely on unit tests nor PyTest. For example, systems that do not have tests or that use other testing frameworks. In summary, we can say that projects with unit tests are indeed moving to PyTest. In the previous research question, we only assessed test framework usage in a general way, but we didn't consider migration commits. Recalling that to be considered a migrated or ongoing project, we need at least one migration commit. From those 39 systems, 27 have at least one migration commit. We consider that the other 12 systems rely on both frameworks but are not performing a migration. The following table shows a summary of the systems with migration commits. We can see that there's more ongoing systems, therefore they have more migration commits, and both groups have 330 migration commits total. In the third research question, we only analyzed migrated systems. First, we analyzed how many days it took to migrate from unit test to PyTest. We defined as fast the ones that concluded the migration up to 1 week. And then we analyzed the density of the migration, that is, of all commits during the migration period, how many were migration commits. We defined dense, the ratios greater than 10%. We found that all fast systems also performed dense migrations. With this result, we see that some projects had a concentrated effort while others, as requests and pandas, took years to migrate. We also investigated when the migration started. We looked for the index of the first migration commit and compared with the index of the last commit. We see that there is not a common pattern here. Systems started to migrate in different stages. Some projects started recently, for example, Salary, when they are considered as more mature, while others, like Salier, started the migration a while ago in its early stages. In the fourth research question, we again evaluate only migrated systems. That is, we are assessing what happened in 102 commits. This table summarizes the frequency of the transformations. The assert migration was the most common, as expected, happening in 92 out of 102 migration commits. We had no migration of expected failure APIs. This table summarizes the line additions and removals of all migration commits of migrated systems. Assert, fixture, and skip migration are the most frequent, and overall, the systems have less lines of test code after the migration, meaning fewer test code to be maintained. We now assess the explanations provided by the developers in 61 issues and pull requests. In summary, we find 9 main advantages and 4 disadvantages. As the advantages listed, a lot of people said that the syntax is easier to learn and understand. Many mentioned the interoperability with unit tests and the easier maintenance of the tests. The main disadvantage is the implicit mechanics. Developers say that PyTest does some magic to perform its functionalities. Concluding, the contributions of this paper are threefold. We provide the first empirical assess the migration of testing frameworks. We present how code is migrated and the reasons for the migration. And we propose practical implications for practitioners and researchers. For example, how developers keep track of the migration and why the migration is not concluded. Thank you all for your attention. Hope you have a great day. Bye.